Hello and welcome to Squizz.com, the connected marketplace. Today I'll be showing you the newest changes we've made to the Squizz.com connector software in the 1.21 release. Squizz.com connector software is a free piece of software developed by us that allows a business to connect any of its business software, databases, spreadsheets or files, storing data into the Squizz.com and Todex platforms, allowing businesses to save and make more money by automating data management and transfer between its systems and other supplier and customer systems. Now you understand what the connector can do, let's look at the changes made to the connector in the 1.21 release. This release adds a new ribbon menu to the connector application, making it easier to navigate through the different sections within the main window with more easily identifiable buttons and icons, hovering tooltips, and a cleaner layout. This all aims to help new and existing users play with the connector software more easily and efficiently. The release also adds the new ability to reassign sales orders, purchase orders, customer account payments, and supplier invoices within the connector application to different adapters, which may be needed for testing, diagnostics, or when setting up new adapters. By reassigning these different types of data to other adapters allows you to change locations or systems where data may be sent to without needing to use adapter data routing. This release makes improvements to allow the connector's Windows host service to start up faster, especially when there are many adapters set up within the connector. This can allow the connector service to load 5 to 10 times faster when 10 or more adapters have been configured within the connector. This release now adds surcharges linked to the customer account payments to be imported through the connector software. If surcharges are applied to invoice payments that customers make, such as credit card fees, then the data of these fees can now be seen within the connector application, as well as be imported with the payment data into supported adapters and systems. This release adds a number of new capabilities to the generic adapters data exports when they're assigned to the JSON XML CSV Web Service file data source type. It includes a new data export setting or pagination that can be used to find the number of records being returned from a server, independent of the records being processed for an export. This is important when data is coming from a web service such as Micronet Harmonic, Pronto, Netsuite, among many others, where the web services limit the amount of data being returned in each request, requiring many requests of pages of data to get a final full record set. This setting allows independently to determine how many records the server is returning, and that then determines how many more requests the adapter needs to make. Additionally, through the generic adapter, there is now the ability to dynamically generate the HTTP requests made to web services when requesting data. And this can be done by being able to use the JSON XML CSV field functions within the data export request settings themselves. For example, with business systems like Netsuite and Xero, their web services require HTTP requests that have the credentials for accessing the web services encrypted and mixed with the current date and time that each request is made. By being able to use the functions like the date time now and the HMAC JSON XML CSV field functions, this allows HTTP requests to have the body data dynamically generated when an export is ran, which is also required for OAuth-based web services. Lastly, the SAP Business One Adapter has been updated to be able to import data into version 9.3 of the system. The connector no longer supports importing earlier SAP Business One versions. However, separate add-on connectors can be built to support these earlier versions for importing data if required. This change does not affect any data being exported from SAP Business One's database. As always, feel free to subscribe to the Squizz.com YouTube channel to stay informed when we release great new functionality into the future. Now let's have a look in detail at the changes we've made to the connector software. In the 1.21 connector release, within the connector applications window, there is now a new ribbon menu that has been added to the top. This makes it clearer and easier to be able to navigate between the different sections of the application, as well as to be able to perform different tasks within each of those different sections. So if we look in the adapters and messages, in the top of the menu, there's now the ability to add new adapters by just choosing the type. We also have the ability to control the connector Windows service from here if you have admin permissions to change Windows services, as well as you can access the different resources now available for the connector, such as its documentation, the latest news about the connector through its Squizz.com feed, as well as view the videos that are available for the connector and the Squizz.com platform. Besides that, if we go into the sales orders tab, we now have the pagination, so let's be able to go through pages of sales order data is now available at the top here. So we can go to the first page of data, and if we have many sales orders records, we can go to last, and then you'll see the numbers update there. We can also refresh this page, such as if you change data within the sales orders, you may need to refresh, or if new orders come in. This auto checkbox is short for automatically, where the orders here should automatically refresh themselves every few minutes to check for if new orders have landed in the connector software. We also have the search capability, so we've got the same searching capabilities as previously, where we can choose a field, and then we can choose to search on that by entering a value in the search box below. And by clicking on the search button, it will then find all orders that match the text that have been here, in this case for the total price of the order including tax. If we clear that out, click the search button, you will now see that the original list of orders that is unfiltered will return back. These same pagination and searching capabilities are also available for purchase orders that have been imported into the connector, customer account payments, and supplier invoices. Now if we go back to sales orders, we can now see that there's 3 buttons here where we can do different things with these orders. So if we look at the import button, we can have 2 options: the import selected sales orders or import all unimported. And that import means import it into the corresponding adapters system that is being configured. So if we, for example, hold down the shift key and then we select another row, what this is saying, we want to import all these selected orders here into our configured system. And that system is based on the adapter here. So we've got this adapter called QuickieMart, which is back here. And it's going to import that sales order into the configured system where that order is meant to go to, and that could be anywhere. It could be a business system, it could be a CSV file, however that adapter has been set up. So after selecting that and click the import button, then you'll be able to import those orders. The other option here is import all unimported orders. So if there's any orders here that are not marked as imported, then you can just simply click that button to import those orders as well. So that's what those 2 options do there. And those are the same options that previously the connector had down in the bottom right in separate buttons. Now we've got also this update section, so we can update the orders within the connector software with all these different options. So we may look at these orders and we may select a few, and then we want to mark them as not being imported. Maybe those orders didn't go into the system the way they should have. And maybe they were cleared out of that system. So then we go back to the connector, mark them as not being imported, and then you could use that import all unimported option to get those orders back into the relevant system again. So we've got the option to not just mark them as not being imported, but we can do the opposite, mark them as being imported again. We've got these other options to mark these orders as being delivered. That means all the lines have been delivered for those orders or not delivered, and that's important if you're doing invoicing and other aspects with the connector. So we've got those 2 options there, as well as we've got this new option, and we'll talk a little bit about this 5th option in a minute. Besides that, we have also the remove section, so we can choose to remove orders that are selected or highlighted within the table. So if we click that button, you'll get a warning whether or not you want to remove them. And if you click yes, they will then get permanently deleted from the connector software. And we may just want to remove all imported orders. So only orders that are marked as yes, do we want to remove them from the connector? So we can click that option as well. And you'll also get a dialog making sure that you want to do that option. So those options are the same for both purchase orders as well as for customer account payments and supplier invoices as well. You've got the same options available for those corresponding tables under these different tabs. Now the supplier account inquiry is the same as how it was previously demonstrated in earlier release videos, is so that way you can query purchase orders from your system and send them across to Squizz.com. We've also got the datasets. So we've got 2 buttons here now to be able to add an existing dataset. And we talked though about datasets in earlier release videos. So I suggest going back to them if you are unsure what datasets are. So we've got 2 options here to create a new dataset, and we can specify where we want to save that, or we can add an existing dataset that already exists on our computer into the list of datasets available here, from where we can then view them as well. And the final tab that's been added, so there's now icons for the connector settings and independently for the notification settings. So that's how that all works there. So using this new navigation should make it more easily identifiable on how to navigate through and access the different data that is available through the connector software here. And you'll note that the buttons that have a dark background are to do with filtering and navigating and paginating through data, whereas the buttons that have white backgrounds are to do with actions to take on changing or manipulating data within the connector software. So you can see that all these sections here are all about navigating, and all the sections here are all about changing data, as you will see there as well. So hopefully this makes it easier for you to use the connector software, and over time we'll continue to make further improvements to the user interface as we go along. In the 1.21 connector release, we added a new capability into the connector software to be able to change the adapter that sales orders, purchase orders, customer account payments, and supplier invoices are assigned to. So if you have a look here, we've currently got these sales orders within the connector software, and most of them are assigned to this QuickieMart adapter, which we have here. And that adapter may be importing those sales orders into QuickieMart. That's an organization's own business system. But in the future, we may want to choose to change and maybe re-import those sales orders into a different system, such as we've got our My Retail Manager adapter here that imports it into that system. So now there's the ability, if we select on sales orders and we click on the update button, there's now this new option called assign selected to adapter. So we can now choose which adapter we want to reassign these sales orders to. So in our example, we might want to assign them to My Retail Manager, and then we may want to then import those selected sales orders into that system. So this is useful when we want to change where these orders are going to, and we might want to do this for testing purposes. Maybe an order imports into one system, but we then want to import that into a different system, or it could be just into a spreadsheet. We can use the different adapters to control where the data then goes to. Now, previously you could do this using the thing called data routing. So we could have a route that says for sales orders, instead push it into a different adapter. So we could push it into the retail manager. But you may not want to do this always, since new orders may come in and they may then automatically go off into that separate system. With this new capability, you do not have to do that. And then once you've, say, played with this data or you've done some diagnostics on it and tested it, then you may want to reassign them to the original adapter if you needed to as well. So we can then reassign that back there. This new capability is applicable for purchase orders as well, where we can select those purchase orders and then assign them to a different adapter, as well as for the customer account payments. As for supplier invoices that we're wanting to import into our own system, we can do that quick and easily through the connector application now. Within the connector's 1.21 release, we've added a number of improvements to be able to speed up how long it takes for the connector's host service to run when it initially starts. Now, if you're not aware what the connector host service is, if we go into the services of Windows, when the connector host service is installed, it will have the name Squizz.com connector. This is the piece of software that runs always in the background and actually facilitates the data being transferred or imported and exported in and out of different systems that the connector is running on. So the connector application here is just the user interface to control that host service and how it plays. But this service here is doing the grunt work on making sure the data is being passed around. So when we start this service or restart this service, we've made a number of improvements to allow it to start up much faster. And that is because of the new way in which we've had these adapters, and all the configurations associated to these adapters is loaded in a much more efficient way. And this is helpful for when you've got many adapters, such as 10 or more, where the connector service can load 5 to 10 times faster. And because of that, it may be useful for when you're making changes to allow those changes to occur on the connector host service much quicker. Now, of course, you have to have Windows user permissions to be able to access the services of Windows to be able to restart the connector. And then when you try to click to the stop or restart buttons here, you may get an error message saying that you do not have the privileges or capabilities of restarting the service. This is only really relevant for where there are administrator Windows users who are restarting the connector service. Within the 1.21 connector release, we've added a new capability to do with customer account payments. And if we click on the tab within the connector application, for any payments that have been imported into the connector application, so that could be through the Squizz.com and Todex platforms, when customers look at and pay for invoices, when those payments go through to the connector software, there is now the ability to be able to include a surcharge within the payment data. So here we have a number of customer account payments that have come through from the Squizz.com platforms. For this payment here, if we look at this payment, within the customer account payment details window, we can see that this payment has been made for $311 from the customer against the customer's account called Spring001. And that's been made from the Squizz.com platform, and there's the user ID and name. Now, the new capability we have added to the connector application and the connector software itself is this new tab here called surcharges. So if a surcharge need to be applied against the payment, such as a credit card surcharge is one of the most typical ones that will occur, we can now see any surcharges that have been applied against the payment. So if we look at this, if we click on this row, we can see all the details of this surcharge. So in this case, a credit card payment surcharge was applied, and that surcharge has that code, and it was for $11 was the surcharge, and of that, $1 was included in tax. So then if we go to the surcharge taxes table, we can see that tax, what kind of tax it was. So in this case, it was a goods and services tax, a GST tax, and then we can see the amount that it was applied for. So in this table, if there were multiple surcharges applied against a payment, we'd be able to click through each of those different records to be able to view the details of each of those surcharges. And each surcharge may have multiple taxes applied to it, so then there would be multiple records that would appear here. So this is how we can see from a user's perspective if any surcharges have been applied to a payment. But there is also the new ability within the generic adapter. So here's a few examples that I've set here. If we click on the settings button and go into the settings window for that generic adapter and click on the data imports tab, we can now see that there are two new data imports that have been added called customer account payment surcharge and customer account payment surcharge tax. So this allows us to configure how that surcharge data that we viewed in the window can be imported into our relevant business systems that the generic adapter is configured to talk to. So if we click on that, we can choose which, in this example, where do we want that surcharge data to go to. Now, typically, you're going to make that the same data source as where the rest of the payment data is going. So here we have the example of that. So this payment is going to an XML-based web service. So we would typically do the same thing, make that match up, and those web services have been configured here previously. And then we can choose the fields on which we want to import into our associated web service, such as we may need the pricing of the surcharges. We can then activate those fields, and they will be included in the generated XML data once we've configured the import content here. So within the customer accounts payments export, there is a new hook that we've added called surcharges that will get all the data from the surcharges data import and then put them into this hook here in a formatted list. We would typically change that to match that, click those save settings, and we would also then go back into our surcharges, and then we would typically build a JSON, since the XML web service will convert the JSON data into XML, which will then get fired off into our associated web service. So we might put in the different hooks that we have available for all these different fields, such as the pricing. And we may want to get some other data out of here, such as the ID of the surcharge itself. And maybe its code is relevant as well. There are hooks available in the body that we can put in the details of that. These fields don't need to be named the same. And instead of key surcharge ID, we could just call it surcharge ID. It really just depends on the web service or how the system is reading this data, what these fields may be labeled. So they could be something different again. So there is another hook here. It's also available for us to embed each of the taxes or the array of taxes that have been assigned to each surcharge record. So we can use this taxes data hook. That will then get all the records that are being configured against this data import, which is the customer account payment surcharge tax import. So if we assign that then also to the same data source, generate each of the tax records. So we may just need to have the tax code, maybe relevant for our system where we're importing this into, and we may need to know the total price of those taxes. They may be the two relevant fields that we need. So then we would build, once again, a JSON string in order to get this data out as well. And we'll use the data hooks to configure the data, how they get configured up. Once we've got all of our data imports for payments, the customer account payments, surcharges, the records and surcharge tax configured, we've used the correct hooks in all of them so they allow a reference. So the surcharge tax records all get referenced in the taxes hook, and then all the surcharge records, which are configured here, all then get placed into the surcharges hook that is placed here, and that goes into that array there. And then this payment record, this export ultimately determines where the data is saved to. So once we've saved those settings, now when we import this payment into our configured adapter, in this case it's a generic adapter, now on our computer we find the associated file that was generated for our example here, which we wanted to generate an XML file. We open that up. Then when we view this XML file, we can now see all the additional surcharge information that has been added with this payment record, including the taxes that have been added. So in this example, we can see how we configure the generic adapter in order to generate an XML file, but it could also be instead used to generate a CSV file, a JSON file, or this data could be sent directly across to a web service without even having to save it on a computer. So that is one of the possibilities that we have available. Now this data can be also imported into all the different supported data source types that we have available. So it could be inserted as SQL into Microsoft's SQL Server, ODBC compatible databases, HTTP, e-commerce standards documents compatible web services, CSV files, as well as SQLite databases as well. So that is all possible. And if you've got any further questions about how to do this, just reply into the Squizz.com connector feed with any questions you may have. Within the Connectors 1.21 release, we've modified the SAP Business One Adapter to be able to support importing data into version 9.3 of SAP Business One. So if we set up that adapter, once a SAP Business One adapter has been set up, if we look within its settings window, there is now the ability to connect to the SAP Business One's underlying database, which is a Microsoft SQL Server. Version 2014 and 2016 of Microsoft's SQL Server, also known as SQL Server, have now been added to the list here of databases where sales order data can now be imported into. So it's important to get this setting to match up the version on version 9.3, and this will then allow the sales orders to then import into Business One. So we are dropping support for versions earlier than 9.3, so that's 9.2, 9.1, and 8 versions 8 of being able to import sales orders into those systems. Instead, you would then have to then use a separate add-on connector or build a separate add-on connector in order to import orders into those older versions of the systems. And if you need help with that, please talk to the Squizz.com team so we can help facilitate that. Do note with this change, the adapter still supports exporting all these different types of data from earlier versions of SAP Business One, earlier than 9.3. So there's no changes to data exporting from SAP Business One, but there is changes to what systems are supported for importing data into Business One. Within the 1.21 connector release, we've added an improvement to the generic adapter for when it is being used to get data from a web service that stores JSON, XML, or CSV data, and that data from the web service is a limited amount of records per page. So if we click on the settings button, within the generic adapter settings, if we set up a JSON, XML, CSV web service file data source, in the settings here, we get to specify how many records per page we can expect to receive back from the web service when it makes a call to request data. In our example here, we're expecting it to return 4 records per page. Now, if we go to a data export, such as product pricing, and let's pretend that this is the data that's coming back from the web service, we look at this data, it is returning a list of products. So in this case, it is returning 3 product records. And within that, it is then for each product record, it is returning a number of pricing records. In our example, there are 3 pricing records that belong to this T-tail product. There are another 3 products that belong to this bolts record product. And there are another 3 records that belong to this chocolate product. Now, our JSON record set path field here specifies how do we find the records, in this example, the pricing records that we need to retrieve. So it's going to find the products object, go through its array and find all the records within its array, and then it's going to find within each of those objects the pricing object and the array of pricing records. So we can expect from this export to return 1, 2, 3 pricing records, 4, 5, 6 pricing records, 7, 8, 9. So in total, it is going to return 9 pricing records from the 3 products that are being returned from the data. If the number of records being returned in this path is greater than the number specified here in the data source, then it is going to try to make an additional request to the web service to get the next page of data. But in our example, the web service may be paging on the product records, not the pricing records. So it could be trying to make a number of requests when it doesn't need to. And that's when the new setting that we've added, this is called this page record count path, has been introduced. So this allows us to specify the path to the object that denotes the object that is being paged from the server, and then that will give us a clear number if we need to get more records or not. So let's take an example. If this is left empty, then it would still use the old way, using the records that is set here, that is returned from this path to denote that. But if we set a value called products, so instead of counting up the pricing records, now it is going to count the amount of records stored against the products object. So that's only going to return 3 records as opposed to 9 records. Now the generic adapter now will look at this object and determine if it's only returning 3 records, and our data source says that we should only get the next page of data if there's 4 records, then it will not make a subsequent request to get more data. That is very much required to make sure that we don't make needless requests to the web service to get data that we don't need. This is what this new setting does. Allows us to independently find the object that we are going to use in order to determine if more pages of records need to be obtained or requested from a server in subsequent requests, as opposed to using the path that returns the records that are actually being retrieved from the web service's response. You can find more information about how pagination works if you go to the squizz.com/doc/connector. And then from there, if you click on the generic adapter, doc. Then if you click on the data export type section, and under the JSON XML CSV Web Service file data exports, there's a section called Data Export Pagination that goes into more detail about how pagination works and what are all the options available to configuring a generic adapter to be able to paginate data coming back from a web service. Of course, you can also go to Squizz.com connector feed and post any questions you have about it there as well. Within the 1.21 connector release, for the generic adapter, when it is configured and signed to a JSON XML CSV Web Service file, and it's being used to retrieve data from a web service, in the HTTP requests that require to get the data, we can now dynamically generate that request using the JSON XML CSV field functions in the different request fields. So if we take an example, we've got a generic adapter set up here that is configured to talk to the Netsuite business system. If we go into the settings window, we've already got a JSON XML CSV Web Service file data source type set up, and that has been configured to the URL that Netsuite have provided to us in order to get data from its SOAP-based web service. And SOAP just is another word for an XML-based web service using the SOAP format. So if we go to our data exports, let's go to the tax codes data export, which gets a list of tax codes. In the export settings, what we can see in the HTTP request body, this contains all the details of the SOAP-based request, which is in an XML format that we need to send to NetSuite service in order to ask for the tax code data. And if we look in this request body, there's the new ability to put in this text called JSON func eval. If that is placed anywhere within this setting, then any data after this must be encapsulated in one of the JSON field functions that we have available that we've talked about in previous releases. And if we go to the documentation and go down under the data section, we can see all these JSON XML CSV data field functions are, but we have the ability to use these functions in order to dynamically generate the HTTP request. Now, the reason why we need to dynamically generate the request is because web services like NetSuite may require us to put in certain pieces of data, such as the date time that the request is specifically being made. And if the same date time is hard-coded or saved in the request, then NetSuite will not allow those requests to go through, and because of that, we can't get any of the data out of that system. There's now the ability to manipulate or to dynamically generate the request by using the field function. So in our example here, we're using the concat function, and what we're going to do is we're going to get all this data, all these credentials, which allow us to access the web service. And with that data, we'll be getting the date time now, which is a property that's available in the request object, and we are going to be using that in order to pass that date data in the timestamp field, which is available here. Now, it's not just that. We are using the hashMac function, which was released in the 1.20 release, and we put it in the credentials, and we are hashing that and putting that into a signature, which NetSuite also requires. And you can see we're using several different functions: the hashMac function, the concat function, the encode function, and the substring functions in order to generate a signature that NetSuite require. Now, normally we couldn't do this before because we had no ability to run these functions before when the request is getting made. So by doing this, we dynamically generate the signature, which is required for NetSuite's web service. We dynamically generate the timestamp using that also NetSuite requires. And because we can do that, we can now get the final request that is used in order to then call NetSuite service to get the data. So anywhere where we put the JSON func eval, any place after that, then we need to use the JSON field functions in order to return the final request data. And we can put that also not just in the request body, we can also use it in the request headers. We can also use it in the JSON record set path, as well as the page record count path and the data export URL. So this allows us to evaluate logic that is then going to ultimately decide the request made to the web service. And we can test this out if we click on the data field function and click on the test export query. Within the query browser, you can see that it will already populate how that data export is configured, and we can see the same JSON func eval within the request body. So when we run that query, so if we look in the request status, we can now see the final outputted body of the HTTP request, as well as all the other details that are being made in the request, the URL that we're calling. And if we compare back to our original body, we can see that in the nonce field, it had this JSON property called nonce that has now been replaced with this text here, which is, nonce is another word for a random number generator that is required to make sure that a unique request is made to that web service. And then we can see in the signature field, the final signature value that has been encrypted using the hashMac function has now returned that value there from the original request that was made here. So using this, we can see the final data that we're going to send in our HTTP request that we can see through here. Because of that, that web service was able to return back the JSON data. We can see in the raw tab, and the data ultimately here, in this example, we're looking at tax code data and all the different tax codes that are available in this NetSuite instance. Now note that if we use the JSON function of our text in any other field, such as the record set path or the request headers or the path, you need to put the adjacent field function directly after that text. So in this example, we can use the concatenation function, and we have to make sure that we put in the single double quotes to denote the value that is being returned by that. Now, if we did not do that, and then we just leave it like this, when we run the query, you will see that the function will fail to evaluate out because this text is not a valid field function name, and then you'll get an error like this where it's saying it's empty because when it tried to evaluate it out, it did not find any functions, so it did the equivalent of clearing this field out altogether. So if you have any more questions about this, it is quite a complex and powerful mechanism. Please go to the Squizz.com connector feed and ask your questions, and we can talk about your specific scenario that you're trying to use this for. Otherwise, look at the NetSuite presets that we'll be deploying in the future releases to see examples of how this is being used.